Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first lecture of this Financial Institutions Management in the Diploma in Applied Banking and Finance. So to start the lecture, I'm going to give you a brief introduction of this subject, first of all. So in doing that, I want to tell now, I think most of you are already either working in a bank or a finance company, or kind of have decided to enter into a career relating to banks or finance companies. So in that sense, the importance is that you are studying this subject most probably to get your career advancements and also to get the necessary knowledge in achieving those career progressions. So I want to emphasize, don't follow this program or the subject only for the purpose of targeting your career progressions, because it is important when you are working in the banking and finance field that you should know why you are doing certain actions and not doing certain things, because this banking and finance is so important. If you don't have that background knowledge about why you do certain things and not do certain other things, it is going to be difficult for you as well as to your own institution, and also even it can impact the entire economy and so many other stakeholders. So with that initial remark, if I may start, now we have about the subject itself. We have to first see what this subject is. So it is about, as I said, financial institutions. When we say financial institution, the main important thing is to understand that it is an intermediary. What do you mean by intermediary? It is in the middle of certain other things which is going to facilitate. And the importance is, it's very important for the economy. For any financial transaction to be made possible, the financial institutions are very important. And if you take an economy without it has come to a state today, some form of financial institution involvement is there in most of these activities. So the financial intermediaries, what they do is kind of facilitating the flow of money. The importance of, again, financial institutions is the product that they are using is something different from a normal good and service. That is, it is because it's money as a good. So they will facilitate this flow of money between maybe businesses, maybe customers, or maybe between the government, like that. About different parties are there. And very importantly, now if we look at this the transfer or the intermediary role, we can kind of have a look like this. If we take the institutions as intermediaries, I think we are aware we have two types of units in an economy, where we have our surplus units. Surplus units are those who have excess money with them. They have excess funds with them. They have excess funds that they can kind of use. At the moment, they are not requiring for their own use. So that's the surplus unit. But in the same time, there is another group that they need money, but they are not having the necessary funds. So therefore, they need to get those funds. So we have these two units, surplus units and the deficit units. So the financial institutions, the main role is they are in between here, trying to do some fund flow between these two units. In doing that, what they are trying to do is create economic activities. Now, in any economy or in any country, if that country is to kind of grow and develop, we need these economic activities to take place. So that is why we say the financial institutions are very important for an economy, for this kind of a transfer or an intermediary. That intermediary happens because of the financial institutions as of now. There were times when people used to have one to other transactions, what we call barter transactions. But now over the years, the world has developed in a state where now there are these intermediaries who are always continuously facilitating. So that is the role of the financial institutions, and that is why we have to we learn about it, and there is special arrangement for the financial institutions. Can you see the slides now? Okay, so in doing that, what we say is the allocation of resources, because in another, if we can look at it in another way, now the surplus units has excess resources, the deficit unit really doesn't have the required resources. So what the financial institution is doing is they are getting the resources, those scarce resource from the surplus unit, and distributing it among the deficit unit the way they require. So that is again an allocation of resources. We can also say financial institutions facilitate the allocation of scarce resources. Now, in the current context where we have been coming through this COVID-19 situation, where we are in a lockdown situation, it is very very evident the importance of financial institutions, because we have seen now whenever like the pensioners or the monthly wage earners need to get their cash to purchase their stuff, the government has to require the banks to be kept open. The finance companies had to be kept open for the customers to go and withdraw, or for them to go to the ATM, banks have to put the money there. Then also when there are many borrowers now, as I said, the deficit unit is using the funds of surplus unit. How it happens is the financial institutions provide borrowings. So these borrowers now, they don't have their normal income to pay their borrowings on a monthly basis. So they were finding it difficult. Then there was something called debt moratorium that was granted. So that is again, the borrowers had to request the financial institutions, the banks and finance companies. Then they had to kind of go through their credit histories and then decide whether these borrowings are, the moratoriums are to be afforded. So like that, we have seen in recent times, I think, the more importance of the financial institutions in much larger way also, because now we are in a very restricted situation, unable to continue with our day-to-day normal activities. We can't move, kind of go here and there as we wish to get our finances. So therefore, there was even more importance was felt during the past few months, I think. So if we look at these financial institutions, we can broadly identify them as the central bank, as the apex institution, and also there are many other different types of financial, if you say the banks, finance companies, leasing companies, then payments providers, payment system providers like different telco companies, then the Lanka Clear like that, then primary dealers who facilitate in government security transactions, venture capital firms, insurance companies. So like that, there is a list of institutions. We will be going through those institutions in time to come. So if we try to identify the different functions of these financial institutions, we can go through it in forms of different transformations, because why we call a transformation is there is some change. So if we take the first thing as the size transformation, what happens is, for example, now the surplus unit had their finances in different sizes. Maybe if we take A, B, C are the people who are in the surplus unit, A will have 5 million excess, B will have 10 million excess, and C will have maybe 50,000. On the other side, if we look at the deficit unit, if there are the people like X, Y, Z, their funding requirements are not same as ABC's availability. So there may be, X may be requiring much larger, maybe 10 million, not 50 million. And Z may be only requiring 50,000. So therefore, what the financial institution does is they get this pool of funds in one place, and then provide the necessary amounts to the necessary people. So that is what we call the size transformation. The next is the maturity transformation. There again, what we call a maturity is how long a person can hold on to this funding as a depositor and also as a borrower. Depositor will have a maturity for his deposits, and on the side of the lending, the borrower will have a time period, how long he can hold on to the lending, paying the installments as they fall due. So there again, how maturity transformation happens is, maybe again, if we go back to our surplus unit where A, B, C are there, A will need the excess funds that he has probably in 3 months because he has collected this money for some event. So that event is going to take place in 3 months. So he needs that fund in 3 months. Then with regard to B, maybe that funds, he has the excess funds. He doesn't need it immediately because he has collected it for some, maybe some future event, which is going to happen in 1 year or so. So he can hold it for 1 year. And there may be the third person, the C, maybe he doesn't really need it immediately at all. So he just want to save it in some place and get some investment income out of that funds. So that is how ABC's requirements, the timings. But on the other side, if we come back to XYZ in the deficit unit, maybe Z wants to build a house. So he is not in a position to immediately pay this loan as he gets. So he wants about 15 years housing loan. And maybe Y is a businessman who needs some working capital for 6 months or 1 year. And again, Z can be another, maybe an importer who wants some funding for 3 months to open an LC or whatever. So therefore, their timings or the requirements of funds are quite different from the requirements, the availability of funds with ABC in the surplus unit. So here again, what the financial institution, the bank or the finance company will do is get that collection of funds from the surplus unit, look at the requirements of the other unit, the deficit unit, how they need the XYZ need funds, and match these and try to provide it to XYZ while ensuring that ABC will get their funding on the timings that they require. So when you pool these funds with different maturities, it is possible for a bank or a finance company to do this because they have a pool of funds with different maturity requirements on both sides, from the fund provider's side as well as from the borrower's side. So that's maturity transfer. Another way financial institution will do their function is they try to transform the nature of the item that we call the assets and liabilities. So if you look at a bank, the bank's assets are the loans that they grant, any other form of like investments. They can invest in a government security, they can invest in a equity investments, they can invest in any other, like maybe buy some the government securities or some other assets. So these are their assets. Then on the liability side, they have their deposits. The highest, the greater portion of their liabilities are deposits from the customers. So deposits are there, and also there will be other borrowings that they get. So these are different forms of assets and liabilities. So when it comes to as a financial institution, again, now assets and liabilities of banks are there to cater to the requirements of the customers. Maybe the depositor, again, that ABC whom I spoke, they want one depositor may be wanting to have it in the form of a savings account. Another depositor can provide it in the form of a fixed deposit, maybe 3 months, or another one maybe for a 2-year or a 5-year fixed year. So that is the forms of their requirements which will match the liability of the financial institution. And again, on the asset side, the borrower's requirements. One may be wanting a pawning advance. So that is, they come and keep their jewelry and get a loan. Another may be wanting a housing loan, as I said. So that's another type of a asset. Then another wants a kind of a trade finance. So that's another. So like this, different types of asset liability transformation also happens when a financial institution is carrying out its activity. And finally, and most important function that they do is this risk transformation. Because we know any business has a lot of risk embedded in those business activities. And when it comes to a bank, it is risk is very important, and even these subjects like financial institutions management, why we are learning is because of this risk management aspect. So risk is very important, and here what happens is, now if we look at again ABC, now I said A wants the money maybe 2 weeks time, but he wants until then to have that money in a safe place. So for him to have that money in a safe place, he decided to have it in a savings account. So what the bank will do is, since bank is a more organized and a more kind of procedurally and policy wise, they have other things like risk management measures. They are in a position to better safeguard these assets and liabilities through their risk management processes. So rather than individuals holding those risks individually, by providing this to the institution, they try to match the requirements. So the surplus unit, the A, he will not lose his money, but also he will, when he's needed, he will get the money. That is what we call the liquidity. Liquidity is whenever someone needs the funds, the financial institution should be able to provide that as the time that is required. So that is, if it is a savings accounts funds, we know, can be withdrawn now even over the counter. So when the customer comes with the passbook, the bank or the finance company will be ready to get that money. So that is the liquidity that the bank provides. That the bank can do that because bank is having a pool of funds, and bank has provided the lending requirements of other customers. Bank will also hold some money, cash, in the form of readily available forms, maybe as cash itself or maybe as government securities, which can help the bank to provide that liquidity to the depositor. So this is the risk transformation. There are different risks involved. The financial institution as an institution is in a position to better handle this risk and ensure that parties concerned are also minimizing their risk in this process. So those are, here what I try to do is, in 4 ways I have tried to explain the functions of financial institutions in this manner. Again, another way of looking at the importance of financial institutions can be also, first is having financial institutions reduce the transaction cost. Why do I say that? Now, again, I told you, now this getting the funds from the surplus units, there is a pool of funds. So with the pool of funds, the financial institution also has a wealth of information, because the financial institution knows about A, financial institution knows about B, C, because their funding requirements are known, what is their background is known, because whenever a customer comes to a bank, there is a specific requirement that you have to know your customer. So in that process, you know about A, B, C. And on the other hand, the financial institution also knows about X, Y, Z in the deficit unit, because they have mentioned what is their requirement, how they are going to pay their loans, how they are getting their monthly earnings, what are the special events in their processes. So these things again known to the banking or the finance company. So this pool of information that is with the financial institution helps them to do their business better. So that is why we say, when there is economy of scale, that is when there are large items, when there is a pool and there is a process there, embedded processors in these institutions, they are in a position to provide these services at lower costs. For example, now the customer, when the customer comes to bank, the bank is in a position to pay a certain amount of interest. The bank is how the bank kind of arrives at that interest is, first of all, bank will see the amount that it pays has to pay to get that funding, that what we call the cost of funds. Then on top of that, what is the kind of different costs that they have to incur to meet these requirements. And they add on that a little bit of a margin, what we call their profit margin. And like that only they set up their prices. So in doing that, when they have a pool of funds and when they are in a position to have all this information and take these decisions, they are in a better position to provide the services at lower cost. That is what we call reduction in transaction costs because of the economies of scale. Then on the other hand, they can also provide liquidity, as I explained earlier, because of their ability to have the pool of funds and the wealth of knowledge that they have about both sides and also other risk management processes. They are in a position to provide liquidity. So that allows the transaction cost to be very much lower than a person who is having surplus funds, individually tries to give it to somebody who doesn't have funds as a loan and then try to manage it. If the A is going to get transact with X on the deficit unit individually, this transaction cost is going to be quite high because first of all, A has to kind of get all the information about X. He has to find out what X, who X is, what is X doing, how is he going to pay the money if he gives some money to X. So all that information. And then X also has to be kind of looking at the kind of getting some information. So because of this, their transaction cost increases. But as I explained, since the financial institution has these economies of scale, they are in a position to provide their transactions, services at a lower transaction cost. Then another way is as a risk sharing. I think I explained it by the transformation of assets and liabilities and also portfolio diversification. What we mean by portfolio diversification is now these financial institutions will not have all their assets in one type of asset. They will be having it in different forms. For example, they will have short-term loans. They will have the mid-term, like the business loans. And also they'll have long-term loans like housing loans. Again, they will have some investments in their government securities. They will have some investments in stock exchange. So like that, they have a pool of assets where they can diversify. Now, even when we take their loans, the loans will also not be to the same. Now, for example, if we look at different industries, they will be catering to different types of industries, maybe to the manufacturing sector, to the industries sector, manufacturing and industry sector, to the financial services sector, or to the plantation sector. So like that, it can be distributed. Again, geographically, it will get distributed within the country and maybe some export business. So like that, lot of diversifications will take place when a financial institution is providing this intermediary service. So that will help the financial system to share the risk. And finally, the other importance is they are in a position to benefit out of this information. Now, what we call the asymmetric information is, now, if we take individually, you and I, or this XYZ, whom I spoke in the deficit unit, or the ABC in the surplus unit, we don't have that pool of information the financial institution has. So there is an asymmetry. Asymmetry means there is a imbalance, like the information that we don't have access to the total information. So because of that, we can do our selections may not be always the correct selection. There can be wrong selection. There can be, we may just look at something and get tempted to engage in certain transactions because we don't have all the information. So this kind of situation is also to the large extent avoided by the involvement of financial institutions. So that is, these are the different ways how we can look at the importance of financial institutions. I hope it is clear why the financial institutions are important. So once we understand the importance of financial institutions, the next what I want to inform you is why we are learning financial institutions management. Now we know there is a subject called management. So that management is also, what it's teaching is management of institutions or management of different entities or management of businesses. But why do you need to learn financial institution management as a separate subject? So that is again this importance of financial institutions as against any other business entity. Now, we know if we look at a financial institution, and very especially the financial institutions that collect deposits from the customers, the importance is compared to another company in the financial institution who's providing the funds for any company for it to do their business. We know they need finances. Without money or without funds, you cannot carry on business. So in the case of a bank or a finance company or any other, maybe a Sanasa society or any other deposit mobilizing institution, the funding, the large part, now if we take bank or a finance company, maybe even to the extent of 80%, the funding is provided by the general public of our country, whom we call the depositors, the savers. They come and they have deposited their money in this financial institution. So the distinction between a financial institution and very especially a deposit mobilization institution and these other businesses is this important. The kind of the trustee role it provides to the managers or those who are managing the funds by this outside group, because they don't have direct access to manage their funds. They are providing these funds to another group of people. They are entrusting that to be managed and then returned to them very safely with a reasonable return. Not only the same amount of funds, but they also want to earn an income, what we call an interest. So that is the reasonable return. So because of this trustee role required by the fund providers in financial institutions, we are having this different subject as financial institution management as against a normal business management. So that's the important. Then again, as I explained, they also have a very wide importance in the macro impact. There's a macro impact because I explained at the very beginning, they have a importance in the economy. They are collecting funds from the surplus unit, then kind of keeping it as a pool, and then looking at the different business requirements, different funding requirements in the economy, and they are trying to fund those. By doing that, what happens? The funding will generate real assets to our economy. Our country's development is getting ahead because of this. Now, what we call the economic growth is increasing or decreasing will happen because of these economic activities only. So therefore, that macro impact is very important when it comes to the financial institutions. And there's another important role that macro impact is now, especially when it comes to the commercial banks. Now we know central bank as a role we call, they are managing the macro economy of the country. So when they are managing the macro economy, they have different tools that they use. Especially the central bank role, if we take, their objectives are the maintaining or preserving the price and economic stability, and also preserving the financial system stability. So in preserving the price and economic stability, central bank pays great attention on the price levels of the economy. So that is what we call the inflation, level. So in managing the inflation, how it manages is it has the tool called the interest rate. There are different tools. So through these different tools, they will be managing the interest rates to accommodate, to properly manage the price levels in the economy. So the macroeconomic impact comes is when the central bank does certain changes in these macro policy changes that has to be reflected in the economic activity. So the commercial banks, they have the direct dealing with the central bank. They get their funding, and also if there are excess funds, they can deposit in the central bank. And also there are requirements when they have deposits, certain balances as against those deposits, certain reserves have to be maintained with the central bank. So these are some of the tools that central bank will use to have the macroeconomic impact that the central bank feels that should be there to the economy. So therefore, that macroeconomic impact is really handled by the transmitter. We call it the transmission mechanism. The transmission mechanism of any macroeconomic policy decisions that the central bank takes is transmission transmission effect happens only through the commercial banks. So this is the two ways the macroeconomic impact happens, how they finance the economic activities, and also how the banks get involved in the transmission mechanism. So that is a very specific role especially the banks have. And because of that, we know the general public at large, they have a lot of confidence in the financial system. They believe that when they keep their funds as deposits, they will get this money back safely. And then the borrowers feel whenever they need some financing, they can come to a bank and then get some assistance to get their economic activities continued. So this kind of public confidence is there. So therefore there is public impact because of this financial institution. This public impact is very important, and that is the most important role, the large important role that financial institutions provides to the economy. So therefore, preserving the customer confidence is very important, because if by any chance the customers feel that what they are expecting from a financial institution is not going to happen, or it's going to kind of disturb in the coming future, then they will lose their confidence and they will come back and ask for the money. So if this is going to happen, even the best financial institution will find it difficult and can have a negative impact on their operations, because any bank or any finance company, they don't keep all their funds just as cash or in treasury bills to pay the customers when they come. They are investing those in different forms, as I explained, because then only they can make use of those funds, earn an income, and then provide the other services. So therefore, even if the best bank, if the customer confidence is kind of disturbed, and if the customers come and start asking money, it's going to be a very difficult situation, creating a lot of distresses in such company. And if that happens, if it happens in one company, that can also move to all others, what we call the contagion risk. That is the risk of one company getting kind of having a difficult situation creates some uncertainty among the customers of the other companies also, because by word of mouth, this can spread very fast, and that can create a kind of a distress situation across all the financial institutions if the financial institutions are not properly managed, if the public trust is not maintained, and if the distrust are building. So therefore, it is very important that we learn, or we kind of follow this specific management approaches when it comes to financial institutions. So that is the requirement. Okay, now to start with move to the next section of the lecture. Now, what I explained was about financial institutions. So before moving to the financial institutions, we have to first learn about what it calls a company, because in any economy, financial institutions are also companies. It is a company, or it is a legal entity that will become a financial institution. So I also want to tell you before I move to that section, now as students of the financial and banking sector, as students studying in this field, it is very important for you to be familiar with what is happening in and around in the financial system in the business world. So I kindly request you to make it a habit to read these relevant things in the business kind. Now at the moment we have access very fast and very kind of large accesses to a lot of information, but make it a habit to always go through the business news. There are many maybe newspaper news or maybe other periodicals, the business news, and try to understand how it affects your own activities that you are doing if you are working, or the activities of the country, or the studies that you are doing. Try to connect them and understand the real situations. Then only you will be in a position to better understand these subjects and also apply them in a better manner. And another good reference reference item when it comes to financial institution management is the central bank annual report. If you take the central bank now, the most recent, the 2019 one was recently released, and you can access it from the central bank website. Central bank website is www.cbsl.gov.lk. If I may repeat again, www.cbsl.gov.lk. Go to the annual reports, and in the annual report, it's good to read the entire annual report with that, because that gives a good, there are a lot of good articles and got knowledge about, you get some knowledge about the economy. But very specifically with related to this subject, the chapter 8 is about the financial system of our country. So that gives a very good narration about what has happened, what is there in the system, and also what are certain plans for the future. So which gives you a good idea. Maybe when you read the first time or the second time, you may not be in a position to understand everything there. You may not grasp it. But if you kind of make it a habit to go through it and try to understand, I think that gives you a good idea about how a financial system operates and what this entire financial system and what's the importance. And also there are annual reports. Now, if you are working in your a bank or a finance company, your own bank, or a finance company has the annual reports. These annual reports also have a lot of relevant information to this subject. So these are some of the reading material. So don't only get concentrated only to the handouts or to the lecture notes. It is important you do a lot of this kind of references for you to better understand and apply the knowledge that you are gaining from these lectures. Okay, so then now we'll look at these companies. Now, a company, we can also say that it is somewhat similar if you look at a human being. Now, human being, how it comes to the world, we say a human being is born. So in the same way, a company has to be first of all born. So what we call, the term that we use is in the incorporation. We call a company is incorporated. And currently, if you look at most of our financial institutions, majority are incorporated. And this incorporation happens under a particular act, that is Companies Act number 7 of 2007. Again, another important thing I want to mention at this time is, now when we learn these kind of subjects, always there are certain legal requirements. So when there are legal requirements, we must be always clear about those things. We must be aware of it, because we can't do financial institution management, we can't work in a bank, we can't work in a finance company if we don't know the relevant legal frameworks, the applicable rules, regulations, or sometimes in your institution you have your own internal circulars, you have your own codes of conduct, you have your other maybe sometimes everything is not in written form. Certain things are kind of self-regulation. So therefore, we have to always understand we can't just behave the way we want. It is not just free for anything. It is a very kind of a governed framework. Within a governed framework, these financial institutions are managed. So therefore, anybody who is doing anything in this governed framework should be mindful and should be well aware of the framework, the applicable rules, regulations, laws, and all that. So whenever again you get involved in some activity, please always refer to these legal frameworks, the governing frameworks, and understand those before you start those activities. Because otherwise, you may face certain risks when you conduct. So sometimes if you are just doing what your boss did, or what your boss wanted to do, or what your previous superior did, if you are just following them without knowing why you are doing them, it could lead to certain risks. Maybe they have not done it in the proper way. Maybe they have overlooked certain things. So if you are also continuing the same and conducting your activities, those can lead to certain risks which you will have to face in times to come. So therefore, any activity that you are undertaking in a financial institution, you need to be aware of the legal framework. So in a financial institution, it starts from this point. This is the point where the financial institution is brought, it's the birth. So that is the incorporation. So it's the Companies Act. So the next slides, maybe the rest of today and the next hour, what I'm going to do is to tell you about the requirements in Companies Act that are relevant to a financial institution. So once this incorporation happens, what is the nature? What is the kind of special privilege that a company gets? They will get the ability to carry out certain activities. They will get what we call a legal personality. So against a company, someone can go and kind of go to the courts and file a case. Or the company, if he wants, can go to the courts and file a case against another. So that is the legal personality, because it is an incorporated body. And also there are a lot of rights, powers, then the privileges that comes along with this incorporation. Those are again listed in the Companies Act. If we look at in our Companies Act, there are several types of companies that can be formed or incorporated, or we call for certain ones registered. So the first one is the limited company. Now this limited company, if you look at most of the financial institutions, majority we can say they are limited companies. They are limited because there is a shareholder. Now those who provide funding to start up, what we call the capital, we call them shareholders. We will learn about them in time to come, some more. But these shareholders, they will be issued the shares, and they are the owners of the capital. They are the owners of the company, and they will be contributing. If the company fails, there is a possibility that they will be contributing if they have initially agreed to contribute to that liability. Now there is a document called Articles of Association. Again, in a future slide, I am describing it more. This document is kind of the internal document that governs the activities of a company. Sometimes you can go back to the Companies Act. Companies Act also has certain provisions, but otherwise, Articles of Association is the internal document that governs the internal workings of a company. So these Articles of Association can say the shareholders' liability. They will say each shareholder will be liable to this extent if the company is to face some difficult situation. So if that statement is there, then each shareholder will have to bear that liability. That is how, in the case of a limited company, the shareholders' liability will take place. If we come to an unlimited company, that means there is no, it's against the limited, it is the unlimited liability. So if a failure happens, then they will have to, there is no limit that they have to, if there is a kind of a liability of 100 million, then the shareholders will have to bear that in an unlimited manner. That's what it means. So if you think about the previous one, in the previous one, the limited liability, it is limited to the amount specified in the articles. But in the case of an unlimited company, it is unlimited and it cannot be limited like in the limited company. The third category is the company called companies by guarantee. The limitation comes by a guarantee. So in this company, there is no share capital. There is no money that has been put as share capital. So those who have come to the guarantee company, we don't call them shareholders, we call them members. The members will come together and form the company with some purpose. But in that case, in their articles, they will be mentioning how they are going to manage it in the case of some difficult situation. So those are the three main types of companies that are listed in the Companies Act, but there are a few other types. Again, another categorization is private companies and public companies. Now, in the Act, what has been defined is the private companies. Now, this, in the case of a private company, as we say, it is private. So when it is private, the company cannot go and raise the funds, ask for capital or ask for borrowings in a public way. All these funding requirements have to be met in a private manner. So it is private arrangement. The privately, few people will come together, form the company, and if they need to raise some more funds, they have to do it privately. So all that happens in a private manner. And also the access, in the case of a private company, the maximum shareholders are limited to 50. If there are going to be more than 50, it cannot be a private company. But in this 50, certain exclusions are there. The employees of the company, if they are also holding kind of shares, they are not considered as into this 50. And also anybody who became a shareholder shareholder previously being an employee, they are also not considered. So 50 is counted excluding that. And if there's more than 50 they are shareholders, then it becomes a public company. It is not a private company. There are a few other kind of special features. Now there is something called the interest register. Interest register is in a company, again I'm explaining it. When a company comes together, there are a group called directors and there are other connected transactions. Those have to be recorded in this register. But in the case of a private company, if the shareholders wish, they can come together and unanimously meaning everyone should agree to exclude that requirement. If everybody agrees, then they can do away with the requirement of maintaining the this interested register. But however, if a situation comes, this private situation is changed. Maybe they don't want to continue as a private company. Maybe this interest register has been required, or maybe they want to change their name in a different manner. So like that, if those things happen, they will automatically go out of the category of private company. So these are the features that have been listed in the document. Then if we look at a little bit more about the limited liability company, as I said, there are no shareholders. It is only two or more people can form the company, and it is in the articles, it will be mentioned in the case of any eventuality how the members are going to contribute to this difficult situation. So that is how they are going to face a liquidation or a distress situation, but there is no shareholder or a share capital in a company limited by guarantee. Then there are another two categories called offshore companies and overseas companies recognized in our Companies Act. Now the importance of these both categories are, both types of companies are companies registered outside Sri Lanka, sorry, incorporated outside. Now I told you what is incorporation. Incorporation is like the birth. So this birth has happened in a country, not in Sri Lanka, but outside Sri Lanka. So in the case of the offshore company, this company that has been incorporated outside Sri Lanka, if they want to come and get a kind of a business association in Sri Lanka, it is not incorporated because incorporation has already happened in another country. What is going to happen is a registration. We call that they are getting a registration. So they have to provide a set of information, the documents. I have listed them here. Those documents to our Registrar General of Companies, and there will be a registration. But important thing is, these offshore companies, though they get a registration in Sri Lanka, they cannot carry out any business within Sri Lanka. The offshore companies, they don't carry out any business inside Sri Lanka. So they have an annual kind of registration that has to happen. But the important thing we have to understand, if we get a name offshore company, that means that company only has a registration, but they cannot do business in Sri Lanka. Now, why these things are important is, for example, if you are going to deal with a customer, and when you look at that customer's documentation, you see that this company is an offshore company. So if that company has come and asked for maybe some facility or something to do some business inside Sri Lanka, then you have to be cautious about it. You have to ask, now you are an offshore company, you are having this is an offshore company. How are you going to do this business in Sri Lanka? Isn't it by definition, you are prohibited from doing business in Sri Lanka? So like that is why you need to know. Even you are working in a bank, finance companies, these situations can come. So that is the nature of the offshore company. Then the other type is the overseas companies. Now, overseas companies, There are also companies that are incorporated outside Sri Lanka, but the important thing is overseas companies can conduct business in Sri Lanka. They are conducting business in Sri Lanka. So they come and get a registration again from the Registrar General of Companies, giving certain documents. They have to give that only within 1 month of establishing their business in Sri Lanka. They have to give those documents. But the difference between the offshore company and the overseas company is overseas company can do business. They are registered to do business in Sri Lanka. Now, for example, if you look at the banking sector, we have branches of foreign banks, meaning banks that have been incorporated outside Sri Lanka. For example, if we take our Indian banks, those Indian banks have been incorporated in India. So their incorporation has happened in India, but they are having a branch here. So when they have to set up a branch here, what has to happen is they have to provide these the documents that I have listed here and get that registration from the Registrar General of Companies. And they can carry out business because they are getting the registration as an overseas company. So they are in a position to conduct business in Sri Lanka. So all the branches of foreign banks, not only Indian, there we have several other like Malaysian, the UK one, then the United States, like that. All those Pakistani banks. So all of them, the branches here are overseas companies. So because of that status of that overseas company, they get the legal personality. That is how it happens. Right. So those are different types of companies like limited, unlimited, guarantee, private companies, public companies, and then finally the overseas companies and the offshore companies. So if we kind of think about like majority of the financial institutions, they are majority. If we look at banks, finance companies, definitely they are public companies. It's a requirement that any bank or a finance company has to be a public company. But if we look at maybe others like some insurance companies, stockbroking companies, probably they are not public always. There are private companies also. So we need to understand when we are dealing with these different types of companies, there are specific natures because those are important to when we engage in some business transaction with this any type of a company. There are specific requirements. Now, for example, if you take a private company, we need to know that they are only raising their funding through private arrangements. So if those private arrangements are not widely available, then they are going to have difficulties. So are we going to kind of, we have to think about that when we are kind of deciding certain transactions to be done with them. So like that, these differences are important. Okay. Now let's see how what is the procedure broadly to incorporate a company. So as I said, for any company, there should be shareholders because the initial funding has to come, what we call the capital. So the capital is provided by this shareholder. So for a company to form, according to our Companies Act, at least there should be 2 or more shareholders. But there is one exception in our Companies Act, which says that there can be a single shareholder. There is permission to have a company with single shareholder if it is a corporate that where the secretary to the treasury is holding shares. Now, who is this secretary to the treasury? Secretary to the treasury is the person who is entrusted with the government funding. The person who, that's the designation of the person that is important, who is entrusted with the government funding. All the funding of the government, he is the key person who is kind of responsible to manage and handle. So if the secretary to the treasury is the shareholder of a company or a corporate, then there is permission in our Companies Act to have a single shareholder, so that 100% of that company will be held by the secretary to the treasury. That has been permitted as an exception. Otherwise, any company to incorporate should have at least 2 shareholders or more. So that is the requirement. Now, for example, we have some companies like even some banks that have been set up incorporated. For example, the bank that was there, that we until recently as Lankaputra Development Bank, which was kind of merged to another bank, that is a company. So that again owned by the government. Then we have another bank now currently as a subsidiary of the National Savings Bank, Sri Lanka Savings Bank. That is again a government-owned company. So these are government-owned companies. But of course, if you look at both those companies, there are the Secretary to the Treasury is owning the majority, but there are few other shareholders also. But the 2007 Companies Act provides Secretary to the Treasury can be the single shareholder in the case of a state-owned company, but otherwise the shareholders are minimum is 2. So to incorporate the company, whom we call the promoters, because for any company to start, there has to be a group of people who are interested in it, who would like to come together, look at some business requirement to see whether they can fulfill that requirement, then kind of get together with few other people, they get the necessary resources and start a company. We call these such people as promoters. They are called the promoters of the company. So these promoters of the company will only start this process of getting the company incorporated. So they have to provide documents. The first document is a declaration from the company to say that there is no such other company similar to having the same name, because you can't have a company having a similar name. The company names have to be distinct to each other, because otherwise there will be certain misrepresentations, miscommunications, misunderstandings among the other parties who are receiving or who are providing services to these companies. So to avoid that, the first requirement is there has to be a declaration. Declaration means as a kind of confirming that to the best of the knowledge, there is no other company having the similar name. Then the Articles of Association, I will explain it further, but this document, what I call the Articles of Association, is the document that provides all internal arrangements of a company. So there is a kind of a alternative. If you don't need to have all the Articles of Association of your own for your company, the Companies Act also has a model article. So a company can decide if they don't want to have these particular articles for their own company, they can take up the position that they are going to use the articles given as a model in the Companies Act as the model, as the Articles of Association. So either way, that has also to be provided. Then to carry out the functions of the company, we need directors. Directors are the people who are managing, like that, who gives the strategic directions, who give the policy directions, how a company should be going forward, carrying out their businesses. So to do that, they will have the director. So each director has to give their consent, because now you can't, the company, the promoter can't just go and give the names of few people and say, these are the people who are going to be directors. Those individuals should give their consent, because if a person goes and gives the name and if such person doesn't want to become a director, then it's going to be an issue. So the director's consent and also a confirmation that he is not a person who is not eligible to be a director. That is also important, because there are certain requirements to be met. So he has to confirm that he is a person who can become a director of that particular company. And then another requirement is the consent of a person to act as a secretary. Because in a company, there are so many procedures to be followed where under the Companies Act. The Companies Act requires a lot of things to be done. So this secretary is the person who carries out or who facilitates most of these things that are required to be carried out by kind of fulfilled in terms of the Companies Act. So to do that, there needs to be a secretary. Sometimes you have an individual person as a secretary, or maybe there is also the option you can use another company. There are secretarial firms. These firms also can be used. So either way, your application should also have this consent from the initial secretary. So once those information is provided with the particular name to the Registrar General of Companies, he will also go through that, and he will now do the register. If he is satisfied with the documents, he will do the registration. How it will happen is, he will have the name of the company, there will be a number. There is a specific number for each company. There is a specific number assigned, and finally, with the name and the number, he will issue what we call a certificate of incorporation. There are different formats given depending on the different types of companies. So he will use the specific type that is depending on the type that is needed for incorporation, and he will issue this certificate of incorporation. Now, this is a very important document for any company. It is like the birth certificate of an individual. Now, once the individual is born, the parents go to a kind of a registrar and get that birth registered. And then there is a the birth certificate that is being issued. So it's like the birth certificate. It's the similar the document for a company is the certificate of incorporation. So if this certificate, if there is no certificate of incorporation, that means there is no company in existence. The existence of the evidence for the existence of a company is this certificate of incorporation. So it is conclusive evidence that all requirements that are needed to incorporate a company have been satisfactorily completed and the incorporation has been accepted by the Registrar General of Company. So if we look at this, there are different formats depending on the types of the company. But if we look at that, it will specifically kind of say what is the name and the number. The number is assigned by the Registrar General of Companies, the date of incorporation, then the nature type, whether it is a limited company, unlimited, or the guarantee company. Again, whether it's a private company or offshore company. So like that, the nature of the company. So this information is there. So I kindly request you, in most of your institutions, this certificate of incorporation is there because those have to be kind of displayed in business institutions. So please have a look at them and understand and kind of try to grasp the importance, because the certificate of incorporation will give the the proper nature of that company to the reader. It will say when it was set up, whether it was a registered one, what is the nature, whether it's a limited, unlimited, private, or it's an offshore. So like that, then you understand what kind of business kind of relationships that you need to have with this kind of company. So that's an important document. Whenever you are going to have some transaction with the company, I think even maybe you are not asking, maybe your legal division asks, is the first document that you have to have a look at. Because then only you know whether this company is really existing. Without knowing whether the company is existing, and if you go and enter into some transaction, and if it is not a company that has been incorporated, then there is a huge legal risk that you are going to carry on, because you are not in a position to kind of enforce any legal action or kind of enforce any contracts on such entity, because there is no legal entity as if there is no certificate of incorporation that has been issued. Right. So once the certificate of incorporation, now there are certain restrictions on certain company names also. And also there are certain ways how you can identify the nature of this company by looking at the name. For example, now we know in certain names, there the word is limited, either the limited in full or LTD as abbreviation. So then what that says is the company is a limited company. Now, there is a small distinction. Now, in the limited company, we have some companies called listed companies and unlisted. Now, listed companies are companies that are having a listing in the Colombo Stock Exchange. Colombo Stock Exchange is the stock exchange where in Sri Lanka, our companies are carrying out their share trading activities. So there are over 200 odd companies that got listings. So if a limited company has a listing, it is different. But if it is an unlisted company, they will always have in their name the word limited or LTD. So when you go through a company name, if you see limited, that means this is a company with limited liability, but it is not a company that is listed in the stock exchange. So that is the understanding. Then when it comes to a private company, If it is a private company, you need to have that word private. Now, within brackets, private, or as an abbreviation PVT, will be there in that company. So again, you know, this is a company that is not in a, that can only raise their funding requirements on a private way. And also certain information will not be publicly available. There can be a situation where there is only interest registers are not there. So we will not know what kind of transactions. Their business dealings will not be publicly available. So that kind of restrictions are there if it is a company that is having the word private in their name. Then when we come to the listed limited companies, they will be either called public limited company, or we also have seen PLC. Now, if you take most of the banks, not most, all banks except one bank. There is one bank that has entered last into the banking sector. They are not yet listed, but other than that, all other banks are listed. It is a requirement for all banks to be listed. So therefore, all banks, if you look at their names, and if you have been working in the bank for some time, after this new act came, they changed their previous names and they have come with PLC, that is the public limited company. So that is indicating they are a public company and they are a listed company. So as we go along, we will learn listed companies have better kind of more safeguards. There are certain other privileges. So these things, then having the knowledge that this is a public limited company again facilitates to do the business transactions in a better way. Then there are some names that they cannot be also used if they are like identical. If there is a name identical, that is a name, then you cannot be. Then the Chamber of Commerce cannot be used unless that is permitted. Then also if the registrar feels there are certain misleading names, registrar can say he cannot use. Then the words like president, municipal, cooperative, there are some names. There are certain restrictions in using those names in the names of a company. So once a name is given to a company, there is a requirement. Once a company is incorporated, really, there is a requirement within 13 days. Within 30 days, a public notice has to be displayed, giving the name, the number, and to incorporate the inform the general public that a company has been incorporated under this name. So that is within 30 days. And if the name is to be changed, that can be only changed by a special resolution. I will let you know what a special resolution is. Only by a special resolution, the name can be changed. And if the name is changed, again, after getting the approval of the registrar, only the name change will become effective. And within 20 days of getting approval, again, that has to be published in the for people to know. So these are some requirements, because always companies are not operating in isolation. They are operating in the general economy. So there are a lot of people transacting with companies. So for them to know what is this company, the company has been incorporated, these changes have, the name change has happened now. So therefore now this is the new company name, like that. So these the public disclosures are there. So those requirements have to be fulfilled by the particular company. Then after that, the company name has to be used properly in all the documents. Now, if you take the business letters, now what we call letterheads, should have the company name properly stated. If the name is not properly stated, that means it is violating these requirements of the Companies Act. Now, for example, sometimes maybe you can check. There are sometimes letterheads. I think now most of these letterheads are not hard copy letterheads that we are using. We are generating them from our computers and generating in the sense we just use what is available, the soft copies for our letters. So sometimes even I have observed there are the logos are there or the trade names are there, but not the company name. In some banks also sometimes. So that is really a violation of this requirement, because in any business document, whether business letters, notices, all business documents, invoices, receipts, everything, this it is compulsory. The proper name of the company is disclosed there. along with the number also, company number also. And even in the registered office, we are given as the registered office, this name and the number should be clearly displayed. Okay, now I've been talking about these articles of association. Let's see what these articles of association and what it contains. As I said, it will have the broadly the objects of the company, then what are the rights and obligations of the shareholders, and also the internal arrangements, how it is being managed or administered internally. So it's like the document which allows the internal workings of a company, starting with the objects. So as I mentioned earlier, in the Companies Act, there is what we call the model article. So if a company wishes, they can decide to use that articles without having a separate articles for your own company. And also sometimes maybe you are having the articles of association, but it doesn't contain everything that requires. In that case, for those things that are not there in the articles of association, again reference will be made to the model article. So in this manner, the internal requirements are there in detail. So I will just show you what are the key requirements under them. Now these are short headings that I have put, but if you really have access to go through an articles of association, it's a very lengthy document giving details of all these aspects that are listed. Now these are the contents of the model article. Model article has about shares, like how the shares, the capital, the different types of capital, how they are issued, how they can be kind of called, then how you have the share register, all that detail. Then about meetings, different type, how you are having the meetings, what are the minimum number, what we call the quorum that should be there, how the chairman or the chairperson is selected, then what are the different, how the meeting minutes are made, so different arrangements. Then about directors and secretary, then accounts and audit, liquidation at a closure, if there are requirements, what are the requirements. And there are so many other miscellaneous things like different information requirements, documents, then the insurance and indemnity, like list of items that have been specified in the Companies Act. So these things are in detail. Like these are just the kind of headings and the subheadings, but every item will be in detail spell out in the articles of association, so that whenever something is happening, you have to always go to your articles and see what is stated there. Is what you're going to do, is it permitted, is it restricted, is the article stating something, and are we doing something proper according to the article? If that is something not there in the article, do we have to refer to the model article? So like that, that kind of references had to be properly done to ensure the transactions or your business activities are properly carried out. Okay, so now I have kind of explained how a company is to be set up in a kind of a brief way. What is the procedure? So that kind of a brief understanding is sufficient for you, because you are really not going to set up companies here, but just to get you an idea about different types of companies and their kind of different features, which will be again important because of those features. What are the kind of implications that it will have for a business transaction? So now let's try to understand who this shareholder, because that's very important, especially when it comes to the normal companies, because they are the people who really provide the necessary funding. So for any company, capital is the requirement, key requirement. Other because normal companies, the majority, at least 30-40% of their funding is provided by the shareholders as capital. So therefore, it's important to know who's the shareholder, what are the kind of rights they have, what are their obligations, and what kind of powers and other requirements that are there. So first of all, who is a shareholder? Shareholder is a person whose name is entered in what we call the shareholder register. Because when shares are issued, any company has to maintain the share register. So the share register will contain the list of the shareholders. But apart from the shareholders, there are also some other instances where we can consider such persons as shareholders. For example, if the person's name is there in the application as a shareholder, he can be considered as the as a shareholder, because at the time of the registration, he will be considered as a shareholder because already his name is there in an application to become a shareholder. Then his name is entered in the share register in some amalgamation process, or a person to whom the shares has been transferred and this share transfer has not yet been properly happened, but the name has to be entered. So even that person is considered a shareholder. And there is a situation where we call a trust, because in a trust, there is no, the shareholder himself doesn't come as the shareholder, but he entrusts his funds to another entity where they are managing the funds on behalf of the shareholder. So in that kind of a trust arrangement also, there is a final beneficiary who is called the shareholder. That person will be considered as the shareholder of the company. So these are, like, apart from a shareholder whose name has been included in the share register as the shareholder, there are a few other kind of instances where certain persons are considered as shareholders. What are the kind of obligations or liabilities of a shareholder? So firstly, as I said, that limited or unlimited liability will be specified in the articles of association, depending on whether it's a limited company, unlimited company, that will be specified in the the articles. And also it is important to kind of for us to know, just because they provided the capital, they are not just liable for any act or any kind of a mismanagement that happens in the company. Their obligations are only limited to the way it is required in the articles. So if because all shareholders are not managing a company, there are separate people who will be managing on behalf of the shareholders, maybe the directors. Then directors have a group of kind of executives, so they are only managing. So if they have done something wrong, or if they have kind of made some kind of a loss to the company, shareholders will not become immediately responsible, but of course, if the company is unable to kind of meet those obligations in an indirect manner, they will become of a kind of they will have to bear those kind of obligations if the articles require them to bear, especially in an unlimited company. That situation can come. Then also there will be certain liabilities for cause, that is when the shares are being raised. So there are certain liabilities that when they have to kind of provide the funding, those liabilities, the share call liabilities will also take place. Then how do they exercise their powers? Now shareholders have certain, now when they become shareholders, they also have certain rights or powers. So there are different ways that certain powers have been given to them from the Companies Act. So they can, there are two ways. They can go to a shareholder meeting and exercise their power. So they go to a meeting, they kind of discuss certain things. Maybe they will have a vote and they can say, we agree, we disagree, like that. So that is one way, by way of a meeting. If not, without a meeting, they can also by way of a resolution, we call. They don't have to go to a meeting and vote, but by by providing a document, which we call a resolution, without a meeting also, they can exercise certain powers. So these powers can be either those are being given to them under the Companies Act or by the Articles of Association. Either way, it can be through a meeting, shareholder meeting, or by way of a resolution. So how this resolution happens is, it is a written document where at least 85% of the shareholders that are entitled to vote at a meeting has agreed for certain thing. So you don't need to go to a meeting, but you get people, at least 85% of your shareholder, to sign a document telling this is something that we want to do. So if that 85% or more have provided that resolution, then that becomes kind of a valid way of exercising their power. But there are certain things that can be done like that. So those, if it is within the power, then you don't really need to go to a shareholder meeting and exercise your power, but by providing a resolution in the form of a written document, you can also exercise your powers. So what are these powers now? Some key powers are like this: to amend the articles. then to have a major transaction. Major transaction means it is going to have a significant impact. There are certain percentages specified as major transactions in the Companies Act. So those will have some significant impact. It's not just the day-to-day transaction, but something kind of important, something significant that will need some the power to engage in such a transaction. Then amalgamation. Amalgamation means you need to you expect to join with another company or with another entity, come together, one or two companies. So that is called amalgamation. The change the capital, want to increase the capital or reduce the capital, or you want to reduce to liquidate the company. Liquidate meaning closing the company. Change the name of the company or change the status. That is like from private, public, limited, unlimited, like that. Those are the status like that. So these are some instances where the shareholders can exercise their power. But in the case of the first three, where they are going to have the articles, the major transactions, and also amalgamation, the resolutions have to be special resolutions. As I said, there are two types of resolutions. Now, resolutions are now when you go to a meeting, you take certain decisions. Those are kind of convened in the form of resolutions. So resolutions are two types. There are general resolutions and there are the special. General resolution is those who present the majority, if they kind of agree and vote for it, that's a general resolution. But a special resolution, for these changes that I mentioned here, that those need all these need special resolutions from 1 to 7. If they are to exercise power, they need general resolution. Again, if they want to go back, like change them now by a special resolution, passing a resolution, they have altered the article. So if they want to again change the article back to the previous, they have to again do it only by a special resolution. Changing the article, again changing the decision to engage in a major transaction, amalgamating, deciding not to amalgamate, they have to be changed only with another special resolution. Then the fourth and the fifth, that is reducing the capital, and also once decided to liquidate, you cannot again change that. Once decided, you have to go through it, you cannot change it. So those are the special requirements. Even if the changes have happened with special resolutions, in the case of first three, you need a special resolution to change them back to the previous. In the case of the fourth and the fifth, you cannot again go back to the previous. You have to continue with the change that you require to do. So there are some other powers also given in the articles and also in the Companies Act, which the shareholders can exercise. Now, what I mentioned about two types of resolutions, special resolution and a general resolution. Now, in the case of a special resolution, it is a majority of 75% of the shareholder. So in the case of general resolution, it is a majority resolution, like whoever who's present, if the majority vote for it, it's a general. But in the case of a special resolution, 75% who are entitled to vote should vote for that resolution. So that is important. And also in the case of this special resolution, now to have a meeting, the Companies Act requires certain number of days notice to be given, because people should have the time to decide and then attend a meeting. So therefore, you can't just inform today and have a meeting tomorrow. So there are specific timelines given to call a meeting. So in the case of a special resolution, at least 15 working days notice should be given to have a special resolution passed at a meeting of the shareholders. So there are two requirements. One is the specific number of days of notice, and also the majority is the 75%, those who are entitled to vote, not those who are present, but those who are entitled to vote at a meeting. 75% of such entitled people should vote for this requirement, then only it becomes a special requirement. So I think you can understand why it's because certain. Now, for example, if I go to the previous slide, the things like changing company's article, things like a transaction or amalgamation, they are not just day-to-day normal things. So that is why Company Act says, if you want to make some amendment, you can't just call a meeting as you wish and just have a meeting and just on a show of and maybe 10 or 15 people and take that decision. You have to have this special resolution. And special resolution requires a special process of having the meeting also, giving specific number of days and also about the percentage of the vote. So that is because of the importance of these activities that can be carried out by the shareholders. Then there are other rights also, like shareholders can ask for certain information now, because again, like in a company, all shareholders do not get the position to get involved in the day-to-day activities, because shareholders do not get involved in management. What they will do is they will appoint the directors and there will be another management kind of team. They are the ones who are running the business. So if they want to know certain things, get some information, they have the right to ask for that information. How they should be asked and all that is given, but then they can ask for certain information as shareholders. Then there are some time, like periodic information that will be provided. For example, like accounts. Now, if you take banks, the quarterly accounts are published. Quarterly accounts have to be disclosed in the Colombo Stock Exchange. So these things are because the shareholders also, as part of stakeholders, will have to know about how the company is operating. So that is the way they get certain, apart from the accounts, there are several other types of information that as returns they are getting. Then they have the power to appoint direct auditors, because any company will have auditors who are kind of responsible to giving the certain assurances on the financial statements. So auditors are appointed by the shareholders. Directors are appointed by the shareholders. Then when there are material transactions, so there are periodic meetings of shareholders. Normally auditors, directors are appointed at what we call the annual general meeting, which is held once a year for each company. So auditors, directors are appointed during this. So these are some of the powers and rights that the shareholders have, because they have provided this in capital and they will be continuing to provide certain capital requirements for the company. Then if you look at directors, so we have the shareholders who have provided funds. Then we have the group called directors. As I said, directors are the top the people who provide the necessary policy directions or strategic directions, or like kind of tell the management, this is how you should be carrying out your business. This is how you should kind of look at your business transactions, what are the kind of businesses you should do, how you should kind of have your risk management frameworks. All that kind of the strategic direction is given by the directors. So the key duty of a director is to ensure that he acts in good faith and he does all his activities in the interest of the company. Now that is the importance. He has to act in good faith, but in the way that he believes that he is carrying out his task in the interest of the particular company in which he is a director. So his interest should be on the company, not on anything else. But again, there is an exception for this requirement in the case of a company where it is fully owned by another company. That is, we call this, the second company is the parent company, the owner, 100% owning owner is the parent company, and the company that is owned by the parent company is called the subsidiary. So this parent company, when there is the parent company owning 100% of a subsidiary, there is this possibility that if it is specifically mentioned that there is no there is exemption, that you don't have to kind of look into the interest of the subsidiary if you are a director of the subsidiary. So I suppose the understanding there is, when it is a parent is fully owning the subsidiary, anyway the parent is safeguarding the interest of the subsidiary, because if that doesn't happen, ultimately parent is going to get impacted. So because of that, there is an exemption. In the case of a subsidiary, if the article expressly permits, the director of that subsidiary is not required to be kind of ensuring the interest of the subsidiary. That exemption is there. But otherwise, in all other instances, a director of a company should kind of act in good faith, as the prime duty is to ensure the interest of that particular company in which he is a director. And there are some concepts that are given which is called the standard of care. And this standard of care means that he should not act in a manner that is reckless or grossly negligent. That standard of care should extend to that level. There shouldn't be the negligence is not, he should exercise all the due diligence that he has to provide. He must take all necessary steps to ensure that he has got the necessary knowledge to perform that particular task in the best way that he could. So the standard of care is taken care of by these requirements: not to act in a manner which is reckless or grossly negligent, and also to exercise degree of skill and care that may reasonably be expected of a person of his knowledge and experience. Now, it is important this says reasonable, because we know a person cannot be kind of expert in everything. So therefore, there will be certain limitations in his knowledge or in his ability to even to get that knowledge or ask from someone or gather that. To that extent, he is excused. That is why it says reasonably be expected. Now, if a person just keeps quiet and take some action, even without looking at a document, asking for some information, not trying to gather some information, then that is totally negligent. But if he has exercised that, he has tried his best to get the necessary information, he has tried to kind of gather some necessary information, he has spoken to people where he could get some information. So with that reasonable kind of due diligence, he has taken a decision, then that is not considered as not being negligent. But otherwise, if he doesn't kind of exercise that proper standard care, then it will be considered as negligent. So that's a very important responsibility that is entrusted on all directors of companies. Now, you can't just be, for the namesake, you can't be a director. There is a big responsibility when it comes to being a director of a company. Right. Then on the other hand, now when you are a director of a company, you get lot of access to a lot of information, because as I explained, if you have to take certain decisions, you need to ask for a lot of information. For example, if you take in a bank or a finance company. So if you have to kind of decide about how lending activity has to be kind of organized, or how it has to be improved, or how it has to be kind of expanded, then the director should be made aware, like how it is happening now, what are the business segments that the bank is currently serving, what are the kind of interest rates, how many customers are being served, what kind of customer groups are, so like that. There are a lot of information, sometimes even going into some individual informations if they are large customers. So this kind of information cannot be kind of used for other purposes. If you are getting this information for the use of the work of the particular company, there is no way you can use this information for any other requirement, or you cannot provide this information to another party to do some other work. This information is important information is provided to carry out the tasks that are entrusted in your company as a director. So you cannot use those for other things. But maybe for business requirements, if you need to use, that's the different now. For example, if you have that knowledge, you have to use that. Maybe you have to share that information with another party to do certain kind of get some other information. So for that purpose, it's okay. But you cannot misuse this information or provide it to a third party to benefit out of that the privilege that you have got. Because only because you are a director, you have access to this information. So you can't misuse that privilege detrimental to this particular company. It's also on the other hand, now when you get information, if you think you have not got enough information to take certain decisions, you also can call for certain other information, or maybe call for certain advice from maybe from an employee or from another professional advisor, so like a consultant outside, or even from another person, another director, based on the requirements. So these are also permitted to the extent that you need to take a decision. using that information, you can get advice from other relevant parties to make a better decision for that purpose. Then the interest, the transaction, I mentioned about interest register. When I spoke about the private company, I said in the case of a private company, if all the shareholders unanimously agree, they can dispense with the requirement to have a interest register. So what is this interest register? As the word say interest, it is about the interest of the directors in the company. Now the director's interest mean, now for example, there is a director who is having another company. If we say now this particular company, if we say is a pharmaceutical company, and there is another company, the same director is having, that company is providing some, maybe importing some items, some medicines, and they are an import of pharmaceutical. So this director can have certain transactions. Maybe this company is getting certain drugs from that director's company. So that is a transaction, interested transaction, because he is also a director in this company as well as in the other company, and the company is having business transactions with this other company. So that's called an interested transaction, because it is director's own company. So there are ways of identifying these transactions depending on the connections. If you are the director, if it is a director's spouse, if the director's kind of child, like that, there are different ways of identifying. So once they are identified, they have to be kind of listed in the interest register. And interest register is something that can be viewed by the kind of shareholders and the public. It's a kind of a public document. It has to be maintained by the company. So again, the company, it is the company secretary in most instances, like is required to maintain this interested register. So that will have the details of the interested transactions of each director and any other party. It has to be, all these interested transactions should be disclosed to the board. Whenever a transaction happens or is to happen, that has to be disclosed. And also in the annual report, because annually there is a book with the financial statements and other information these companies are producing. It has to be mentioned in the annual report. Now, for example, if you take the bank or finance company annual report, you can see there are large number of disclosures as related party transactions. They are the ones that are called these interested transactions. So these interested transactions will have to be separately informed to the board, mentioned in the annual report. And also, if they are not disclosed, that doesn't mean it is not going to be affecting the transaction, but the person who did not disclose it will be violating the act. So merely because the transaction is not disclosed, the transaction doesn't get kind of discontinued, because that cannot happen, because it is the responsibility of the particular director to disclose it. So it is only the director who will be violating the provisions of the Companies Act, and there are certain, it is considered an offense, and certain punishments that are listed in the Companies Act. So it is the kind of the legal obligation of every director of a company to ensure if there are interested transactions that they have been properly disclosed and the necessary requirements in the Companies Act are being followed with respect to such transactions. Why this? Now we need to know why, what is the importance of this transaction? Because now when there are interested transactions, and if the director is in a position to kind of influence these decisions, he can always take the decisions in his favor, sometimes which is detrimental to the company. For example, as in that example, maybe this is a high value pharmaceutical kind of item, which the company is going to decide from whom to buy. There are so many other importers, so the company is going to decide. So maybe it has come to the director board for whatever the reason. So the directors are going to decide. So if this is not informed to the director board, there is one importer who is whose company is also the company of the particular director who is taking this decision at this moment, then others don't know. So maybe they will just kind of unknowingly, if this person says, no, we will get from that company, others also maybe unknowingly just saying, yes, okay. So therefore, in order to ensure that there is such interested transactions doesn't happen in an adverse way to the particular company, these requirements are there. You have to identify them, you have to inform it, you have to disclose it, you have to get a kind of inform to the board. Now, when you come to the banks, there are even other situations, like in the case of a related party transaction, you cannot be at the time when you are deciding on such transaction, you can't be a party to that decision. You have to be required that this decision has to be taken without that particular director. If it's a related party transaction that the board is going to decide, the vote has to be like 2/3 majority vote, excluding the particular director. That is because of the importance. Because if that decision is taken by the directors just without just not looking at the interest of the company, but only looking at the importance of giving it to the particular company of that director, it will be something adverse to this company. So therefore, these requirements are there. And in the case of a bank, those are some stricter requirements than a normal company. Right. Then about the use in the company information, I think I slightly mentioned a little bit earlier also. When they get this information, they cannot be used for any purpose other than for the requirement of the company. So for that, the only exceptions are if it is for the purpose of the company, if it is required by law, and where the articles authorize or the board has given some specific authority for a director to use it for specific purpose. Then only this information can be made available. That information, otherwise such information cannot be used for any purpose other than for the company's use. Then moving to appointment of directors, how directors are appointed or how they are removing. Again, the Companies Act has certain processes. So in the case of a public company, there should be at least 2 directors. If the 2 directors are not there, at least 1 director. So in most instances, it has to be at least 2 directors. But in the case of, for whatever the reason, if 1 director is not there, if the company is to continue, at least that single director has to be there. So there are certain disqualifications that are mentioned in the Companies Act, which says if the disqualifications are met, such person cannot be a director. These are the age for a person to be a director. He should be either 18 or more. That's our age of majority. Then he should not be considered as a insolvent person. What do you mean by insolvent? Insolvency is a kind of a situation where a person is unable to meet his financial obligations. So this is a situation normally a court will kind of identify a person as an insolvent. So if that kind of a situation has a meaning, he has been identified as a person who has been unable to meet certain financial obligations. So in that kind of a situation, he is not qualified to be a director of a company. Then there are certain prohibitions which says such persons cannot be directors of this company. Sometimes this can be there in the articles, or maybe in some other law which says this type of a person cannot be a person in the particular company. So if there are specific prohibitions like that, then that's a disqualification. The unsound mind, again, that also comes normally out of a kind of a court or a situation where somebody has identified that he has unsound mind. So definitely when the person with unsound mind cannot become a director of a company. And it has to be a natural person, like an individual. You can't have others as directors. And also the articles should not have any disqualification. So These are broad disqualification. If a person is subject to this disqualification, such person cannot become a director of that particular company. But when it comes to banks, finance companies, there are further other requirements also. Now, these are in the case of a normal company, but if it's a bank or a finance company, there will be a few other instances also considered as disqualifications depending on the situations. Then directors should always give their consent. I think I mentioned to you at the time of incorporation, the one document that is required is the consent of the director. So consent, and also to say that he is not disqualified by being a director. So that has to be given when he is becoming each time, not only at the incorporation, even after incorporation. If a new director is appointed, that director, when he is to be appointed, first thing he has to do is he has to give this document giving his consent and also informing that there is no disqualification. Then in the case of public companies and also a private company that's a subsidiary of a public company, there is an age limit given. So director can continue as a normal director until the age of 70. So when he reaches the age of 70, he has to inform that to the company. If he doesn't do that, that is again a violation of the Companies Act. So once that the 70 is reached, after that, if the particular director is to be continued as a director, he has to be appointed by the shareholders on an annual basis. So this appointment has to annually happen. In the case of a normal director, it doesn't happen annually. There is what we call the rotation. So normally it's like once in 3 years only that appointment comes. You can continue for a certain period. But once such a director reaches the age of 70, according to the Companies Act, each year that particular director's name has to be taken up at the annual general meeting, and at the annual general meeting, the shareholders have to approve the appointment for the subsequent year. So that's a special requirement. So I suppose you are aware in the case of banks and finance companies, this has been further restricted by telling, in the case of a bank or a finance company, when a person reaches the age of 70, he cannot be a director beyond that. There is nothing like going and getting approval from the shareholders. The requirement is you have to after 70, you can't be a director. So I think I don't want to again explain, but this is because of certain distinctions between a normal company and a financial institution, which is different and has some more specific roles when it comes to their performance. And things like other remuneration and other benefits or indemnities that can be provided to directors, these all have to be either provided in the articles or will be governed by the way that is provided in the Companies Act, and they can be provided by through ordinary resolutions of the the shareholder meetings. Yes, then there are some other things like loans and all that, how to provide a loan. These things are specified in the Articles of Association, or in the Companies Act. So those provisions have to be followed. Then there is another obligation on the part of the articles, which says that, not obligation, there can be specifically expressly specified in article where if in good faith, after doing something, taking a decision, if a director has to face or a company has to face some difficult situation and there is some legal obligation on the director, that company can indemnify that. You indemnify meaning company can reimburse that liability that comes to the director. For example, a decision, they take some decision, they have looked into all the information that is available, the necessary other researches have been done, expert advice has been obtained, but still after doing all that, in good faith taking a decision, after that, due to whatever the reason, some litigation has been filed, and now a director is found as a person who has done something wrong. So in that situation, it's an individual liability on the director. But then the articles, if articles provide then the company can indemnify that. If that has been done in good faith, there is a possibility, if it is provided in the articles, for company to meet that financial obligation on behalf of the director. And also there are certain insurances that are there. The company can always get that indemnity insurance and then face that kind of a situation. There's another big obligation on the directors, like if they feel, as we are now conducting business, if a director feels there is a time, the future is going to be a situation where the company is going to find it difficult to meet its financial obligations. There are certain debts that the company is going not to be able to meet them. They may find it difficult to repay. They are not going to be able to pay. So in that kind of a situation, he should really call for a meeting and then take certain decisions, and if it is needed, proceed for certain winding up operations like that. So when you come to know that your company is going to face some difficult situations in the future, you can't just kind of keep silent or just keep it to yourself. There are obligations from the Companies Act that are laid on the particular director. He should act on that and take certain decisions and proceed accordingly. So that is the obligation. Then again, if there is this situation called the serious loss of capital, that is inability to meet the liabilities, the net assets, what we call net assets. Net assets are the total assets minus the liabilities to outsiders, not the shareholders, outsiders. So that is really the share capital and other reserves. That is what we call the net assets. If the net assets are getting deteriorated, that is called the serious loss of capital, then again there is an obligation that they have to call a meeting within 20 days notice, and then have this meeting and decide what they are going to do. So these are some of the obligations or kind of responsibilities that are entrusted to the directors because of the fiduciary role that they undertake as directors of the company. So there are shareholders who have kind of given their capital, carry out the activities of the company, and they appoint the directors to kind of give the strategic direction to the management. So the directors have the big responsibility on behalf of the shareholders and any other stakeholders to ensure the company is carrying out business properly, and there is a long-term sustainability, there is a future for the company is in a good shape. So to ensure that, there are certain rights, certain requirements, and also certain obligations entrusted by the Companies Act, and those have to be carried out. Then there are two new concepts that came with this 2007 Companies Act, which are now become kind of embedded in all the company's processes. So one is about the stated capital, because earlier we didn't have this concept called stated capital. We had what we call the paid up capital. So now it is called the stated capital since 2007. And this capital forms all sorts of amounts that a company thinks forms the capital of it. It can be the money that is already there, but has to be called, and even not only in cash or even contributions in kind, that also can be considered by the directors of the company as part of the capital. So as I mentioned, if the company wants to reduce its capital, it has to be by way of a special resolution, and that has to be again given public notice before 60 days of passing such resolution. Then the solvency test is another new concept that came with the new Companies Act in 2007. What it says is, whenever the company decides, the board of directors decides to declare dividends. What is dividends? Dividends is what a shareholder gets as a return. Now, for example, if a person deposit money, you get interest. So similarly, the return that a shareholder gets for the money that he puts as share capital is dividends. So when a company carries out its business, it earns profits like throughout the period. So the process is normally every year, annually, if there are profits, part of these profits are distributed among the shareholders as their return, as dividends. So when a company decides to distribute dividends, they have to conduct what is called the solvency test. As the name suggests, what it means is you have to ensure after you pay the dividends, the company is not going to get insolvent. That is what it basically tries to say. Because when you pay dividends mean you have to, a chunk of cash from the company will have to be paid out to the shareholder. So shareholders are the people who are providing the necessary funds. So if you are without checking the ability to continue as a solvent institute, if you pay that, and if the company becomes insolvent, then after that you can't continue the company. So the whole idea is you have to conduct this solvency test, and it is conducted by the auditors. The company will provide the necessary information, the financials and any other additional information. And after providing that, if they're conducting this information, the solvency test will have to be provided and a solvency certificate will have to be obtained before the company decides. The board of directors decide to pay the dividends. So that will ensure after paying the dividends, company is still in a position to conduct its normal operations. So I think I have explained the process, and this comes to the conclusion of my presentation today. And I appreciate the attention of all your attention. If you have any queries, or maybe at the next time I can take them up, and also by way of email, if necessary, you can kind of seek those clarifications. I will provide the email next time. Okay, let me close the session.